Good morning, my friends. Welcome to Sunday morning at Issaquah. It is so wonderful to see you. We're all ready for a nice day of learning and stupendous, informative, wonderful, deeply satisfying Bible study. We're in the book of Mark. And as of late in this study, we have been looking at various challenges of being disciples of Jesus, and today is no exception. We will be in chapter 10, which is going to be dealing with the subject of marriage and divorce. And, when I first, at first glance back a while ago, knowing that we're going into this subject, which is a subject like, any other subject, something to learn about. But I did have automatically in my mind, here's what I'll say about that. And, but I thought, no, maybe I better stop and back up and do some fresh study on this and see if we can delve into this question in a way that's understandable and also practical because of the society that we live in. And it's not at all improbable that you're going to, at some point in your life, if you do such things, study with someone that's divorced, and you're going to run into situations among Christians. And so what are we going to tell people when it comes to this particular subject? So that's something that we want to keep in mind. So we're going to be as thorough as we can without belaboring. And so after a word of prayer, and Ray is going to lead us in that prayer because I just voluntold him. And so let's pray and then we'll get going here.
Heavenly Father, thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for the word. Know about what Jesus would like us to learn. And thank you for Daryl that his preparation for the class here, and be with him now as he tries to augment our understanding of this subject. It's in Jesus' name I pray.
Amen. Okay. Okay, so let's look at our text as we prepare this morning. Mark chapter 10. It says, getting up, he went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife. And he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. In the house the disciples began questioning him about this again. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. All right. So if you're familiar with the Bible and familiar with this teaching, you know that there are other things that Jesus said about this in other accounts. But I want us to understand and we will talk about this, why in the book of Mark is it handled this particular way? And there is a very good reason for it. Okay, as we look at it from Mark's point of view, teaching a Gentile Roman audience. So we'll get into that. All right, so as we begin, so I can get in trouble like right here from the very start, okay? So here's how I'm going to start this and try to set some parameters as far as what we're talking about and who we're talking about. So first of all, as I stand here right now, I do not believe that the teaching that we're discussing here applies to people who have not yet agreed to enter into a covenant with God. If they have not, they're lost. It doesn't matter if they've been married once or 150 times. It's immaterial. Okay? So we're not talking about people who have agreed to live by the terms of God's covenant. Okay? So first of all. Second of all, I do not believe that this teaching applies to Christians whose marriages are touched by physical or mental or any other kind of abuse, and one of those individuals, or maybe both of them, at a given point in time, can't be in the same place. And so my position on that is that if somebody comes to me, a Christian, and there's some kind of abuse or something going on in that home, and they get out of that home, I'm not going to tell them to go back. I'm not going to put that on myself as if I know what's going on behind those closed doors. And I'm going to put myself, well, you need to go back. There's a lot of, well, I just say over the years, I've heard a lot of stories, especially with Christian women whose husbands are pigs. And they get out of that situation, and then you have other, usually Christian women, telling them, well, you need to be a better wife, you need to do this, you need to do that, and the women go, you know what, I'm out of here. And they just leave the Lord and they're gone. That's a big thing for somebody to do, okay? So I'm not going to do that. Work with people, help people, try to come from a position of being my best, and but I don't believe that that's what we're talking about. They didn't ask, is it lawful to separate under harsh circumstances? That's not the question. The question is it lawful to divorce? Okay, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. Okay, you get me? All right. Thirdly, I do not believe that anything that is taught in here, although sometimes we hear preachers, I've done it myself in the past, I don't believe that anything that's taught in this teaching gives Christians a right to divorce.
Say it again.
I don't believe that anything that is being taught here, except for when Jesus talks about immorality, that anything that he's going to be talking about gives Christians a right to divorce. Okay, and so we'll talk about that. Okay, so with that, if there are no comments or questions, then I want to sort of lay out what we're going to be covering. Okay, what are some of the questions that we want to address in this study? So first of all, I started right out with the answer to the first one. What is the broader context of this discussion on divorce? And the broader context is the challenges of being a disciple, okay? Denying yourself, taking up your cross, etc. And so that's kind of the broader context. Secondly, why did the Pharisees ask this question?
That's a good question.
Okay, why did they ask this question?
That's a good question.
Okay. Thirdly, what was wrong with these Pharisees' approach to the law? Okay, so we're going to talk about how they, were approaching the law, and the way they were approaching it wasn't right. And we'll talk about why. Why is this teaching so important for a Roman audience? Okay, why is it so important for a Roman audience? What were the prevailing views on the subject of divorcing a wife? Okay. How does Jesus answer the question? So of course that'll be part of the important part. How is he going to answer this question? Is it lawful for a man to divorce a wife? Okay, he's going to answer that. What makes the nature of marriage, of the marriage bond, what makes it unchangeable by culture? Why can't the culture that we live in, why doesn't that change the nature of that marriage bond? Okay, we're going to talk about that. How does Deuteronomy affect this discussion? So we're going to go to Deuteronomy 24, the text that Jesus is going to be alluding to. How does that affect things? What is contingency legislation? Okay. Contingency legislation. So we're going to talk about what that is and how things that God has said in the Old Testament about marriage and divorce. Okay. We're going to talk about this idea of contingency legislation. How did God, or did God give conditions in the Old Testament that made it okay to divorce under certain conditions? All right, so this is where we're going to, I think, have some fresh learning here because of some assumptions that we have made that there are certain things that Jesus is going to teach. And I know about the exception of immorality, okay? But aside from that, there are things that it has been believed that Jesus is teaching that makes it okay to divorce. Okay, so we want to delve into that. Do we find God's true intentions for marriage in Deuteronomy 24? Do we find his intention for marriage in Deuteronomy 24? And then second to last, why did God allow a man to give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away, divorce her? Why did he allow polygamy or Israel to have a human king? Okay, so he allowed this thing, right? He allowed the marriage certificate, the certificate of divorce. He allowed polygamy. Okay, he allowed them to have a king. And so how are these things related? Okay, all right, so we're going to look into that. And then last but not least, is it lawful for a Christian to divorce a spouse because they don't like them as long as they don't remarry? Okay, that's an important question. Okay, it's an important question. Does 1 Corinthians teach this in the case of unhappily married couples who are Christians? It's okay to divorce, don't remarry. Okay, we're going to explore that. Okay. Did that spark any questions or comments?
That's a heavy load.
Yeah. So these are things, points that I think are going to be important for us to answer. Yeah, Todd.
I think this is so cool that after 30 years, you're it was about 30 years ago, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, the good old MDR.
Yeah, I think it's so cool that you were not frightened away from it,
Yeah.
from the subject.
Well, what's the
That's
point?
just Todd saying, I'm proud of you, man.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I took the heat on that one. Sure did.
Lives on to this day.
Well, yes, it does. Look up Daryl Bean on Google, and that's what you get.
Yeah.
False teacher. Teaches you don't have to, you can just cohabit, you don't have to get married, and all that. And that's from teaching from the Old Testament. In fact, reading here in Deuteronomy in preparation for this, in the Old Testament, people, they made a covenant and they cohabited. That's what I taught. But people took that as, oh, so you're teaching that you don't have to get married, you can just cohabit. Well, that's just not true. You know, just didn't, that's just not the truth, but, yeah. That was then, this is now. Okay. All right, so let's start out with this. We know in Malachi, God said, I hate divorce. Okay. Now, the question is, why did he say that? Now, you have to kind of have the context of Malachi 2 in your mind a little bit to answer that question. Okay. So, men were divorcing their wives. And God said his altar was filled with tears, the tears of these wives, that these men were treacherously divorcing. Okay. Don't want you anymore. And so here's a woman, she's left without a husband, and in that society, that was a big deal. In fact, that reflects some on Deuteronomy 24 as to why this woman was given that marriage, could be given that so she could marry another man. Because for a woman not to have a husband, that was a hardship, a big hardship. And so here's the point, is that if there's a divorce, there's sin in that home. Okay? If there's no sin in the home, no practice, why would you? Okay? You're walking in God's ways, there's peace, there's harmony, things are as they should be. But if there's a divorce, then something is wrong and people are getting hurt and sin is tearing that family up. Okay? And so he hates that. It isn't the going to the judge and signing papers. That's not what it's about. Marriage isn't about that. Because if I do a marriage ceremony and those people make that vow, paperwork has not been filled out, but they are just as married as they're ever going to be. It's not about the paper. It's about here. It's about here and here. Right? And so what the Lord said about vows in the Old Testament is, if you vow something, pay your vow, for the Lord does not delight in fools. Okay? So you made the vow and you're bound to the vow. Okay? And so what he hates about it is what causes it. Okay? And it's sin that causes it. So the question they come with here is it lawful? Now, we're going to see that these Pharisees have a certain approach to the law that's really taking them off the beaten path, right? Now, here's the thing. They come and ask this question. Well, it's well understood that most Jews took for granted that a man had an inalienable right to divorce his wife. If I want to divorce my wife, I can divorce my wife. Okay? The women didn't have that right. Okay? So they, so to speak, put themselves in the position of the Lord of marriage, and I can divorce my wife if I want to. Now, the later rabbis, as we'll see, argued this was a big deal, and it goes back to Deuteronomy 24, which we'll talk about later, some indecency, and they argued about what did that mean. Okay? What did it mean? What were the legitimate grounds for divorce? Not whether it was lawful. Note the distinction. They weren't arguing about if it's lawful. What are the legitimate grounds? Okay, so that was the emphasis. Of course, lawfulness comes into play to a certain degree. All right. So as I said, Jesus has been teaching about the demands of being a disciple. And in this teaching, it's no different. He's setting forth some very stringent demands for disciples. And his teaching on divorce is just another example of what we might call the radical claims that God's reign has on individuals. When you agree to that covenant, when you agree to enter in, and remember, covenant is not negotiated. not negotiation between God and us. God says, here it is. Take it, and I'll bless you. Leave it, and all kinds of harm is going to come to you. Okay? Deuteronomy 28 is a perfect example of that, but that's the nature of the covenant, is that you take it or you leave it, but it is not negotiated. All right, so these are some demands that the Lord has placed upon his disciples, his people. All right. How we doing? Okay. Hey, if anything doesn't make sense, well, I don't have to tell you. I don't have to tell Israel on this. Somebody's going to go, hey. Okay. That's a good thing. All right, so when we talk about the Pharisees' approach to the law, they come at the law asking what it allows them to do. Okay? You just think about if we came to God's word as Christians today and said, okay, all right, what does it allow me to do? What can I get away with? Okay. That's not going to yield. That's not going to yield good things. Okay? But that's kind of how they're coming at it here. Because this approach ultimately neglects the will of God. And understand this as we talk about this subject. And I'm just gonna pop forward here in Mark to Mark 12, 31, and just to point out what the will of God is primarily concerned with, and we all know these words. Okay. So verse 30, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you know what the next one says. Okay. The second is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Okay. The will of God is that we love him and that we love our neighbor as ourselves. And what we're talking about with divorce and this kind of approach is we're completely neglecting to do the will of God. If I come to his word in that way, what can I get away with? These guys they weren't concerned, as we're going to see, we'll talk about, we're not talking, what can I, a man, get away with? I'm not thinking about the woman. I'm not thinking about the children. What can I get away with? And I'm not being concerned here about loving my neighbor as myself. And we've tried to emphasize how important that is going to be on Judgment Day. Okay? How did we treat people? Okay. They say in heaven love comes first, right? Okay. And it does. So this approach is just going to not get it done when it comes to doing the will of God. So they're interested in their rights instead of their responsibilities. Okay? Rights, responsibilities. But they're interested in their rights. Is it lawful for me to do this? And they're pursuing legal, is it lawful? They're pursuing a legal justification for their behavior. And this is where the problem comes in. No matter how it affects another person. Okay? Am I legally justified to do this in spite of how it affects others? And that's a direct violation of God's command.
Good point.
Yeah. Direct violation. That's what this is about. Okay? That's what this studying this subject is about. Okay? And so don't forget that. And if I'm teaching someone about this, I'm going to emphasize this really strongly. Okay? Now, they ask about a husband's right to divorce. And as I said, they pay no attention to the needs of the wife or of the children. And so Jesus, when he answers this question, is going to uncover their sinful hearts behind the mask of legal rectitude. See, we want to make sure we're awful. Okay? But he's going to expose their heart. Yeah, Steve.
I'm going nowhere with this except to say, just as a data point, has there, in the world that I've lived in, my parents were divorced, you know, in other words, divorce has been in my life right along. So I'm not trying to say that there hasn't always been divorce.
Right.
But it is interesting to me that when I began my life 70 years ago, divorce had a certain bad stigma to it. That doesn't exist today, at least as much as it used to. And so I asked myself the question, what's changed? What's changed is culturally in our country, there's much more of an emphasis put on what's in it for me. That there's a, you know, that we sort of live in a world now where everybody's kind of right at some level or another. All I'm trying to say, and my little quick comment here, it wasn't so quick, was to say that once it gets on to me as a culture, we have watched the incidence of divorce dramatically increase.
Yeah.
There's something going on there with my approach to life. At least in my work, in my 70 years, I have watched as the focus gets more on me, the incidence of divorce goes significantly up in this country.
Yeah.
There's something for us to learn there about what's my mental, how am I approaching this?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, you know, and there's a bunch of stats, you know, I could have presented here.
Sure.
But this suffices to just recognize that. Okay? And I'm always reminded in a discussion like this of an article that the late Charles Osgood wrote back when, and I may have mentioned this in the past, but back when Charles and Diana were splitting up. And the article was entitled, "The Pursuit of Happiness Becomes the Flight from Sorrow." Okay? The pursuit of happiness becomes the flight from sorrow. And his point was that people, as you were saying here, see, people get married with the idea of, what are you going to do for me?
Exactly, that's better said.
What are you going to do for me? And people have all kinds of demands. You know, you remember the Tom Cruise movie. But anyway, that one scene where, you know, he's looking for his wife, you know, Renee Zellweger or whatever her last name is, you know, and he says to her, you know, you complete me. Well, run, baby, run, because nobody can do that for you. Okay? And so we get married thinking, okay, this is the one. Well, the one, you know, what does that mean? Going to make me happy, going to give me what I need. But what happens when you find out that that person can't give you what you need? Nobody can. When it comes down to it, okay, and now, I'm not happy, and so I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to look for you know. So people that, when I see people that have been in multiple marriages out there in the world, to me, that's like, okay, you're still trying to find something to fill that God-sized hole. Okay? and you're not gonna find it in another community, you know? So, anyway, yeah, Robert and then Rick.
So, that applies to mankind over the ages, I think, with regard to this question. But as I was reading through this, it came to mind, you know, we understand that the Pharisees and Sadducees had different perspectives with regard to angels, spirits. Did they also have different perspectives with regard to marriage and divorce? Because, again, the Pharisees apparently were focused on creating all these guardrails
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
help the nation be holy.
Right.
And, you know, when I look at this question, I can say, well, it was for, you know, the fact that their heart wasn't in the right place. Or, you know, they're trying to get Jesus to support their guardrails with regard to what are the justifications for marriage and divorce. And honestly, I haven't studied whether the Pharisees and the Sadducees had different perspectives on this. I don't know if you have, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
interesting to me that this is, you know, they seem to be looking for a loophole,
Mhm.
or they seem to be looking for support in their perspective of marriage and divorce.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's remember, just think about the Pharisees in general, and let's remember what their strictness with regard to the law produced, what the problem with that was. And they lacked compassion, okay? And so this is just another example of being so stringent, what's lawful, that they forget the compassion part. And Jesus, how many times did he do an act of compassion on a Sabbath so he could underscore how, you know, you'll pull your donkey out of a ditch on a Sabbath, but I heal a man with a withered hand or whatever it be, and now you got a problem. See? So now, that's a good question. I didn't look at that particular question, and I will, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, if they had a different view on marriage. That's a good question. Never had that question before. So, all right, yeah, Rick.
Yeah, you know, I agree with Steve on the, you know, I also kind of, my first exposure was Catholicism, and it's to his first point, you know, where more and more divorce is more readily accepted, parallels people making themselves their God. Because when all you have to do is answer to yourself, okay, there's no social stigma anymore.
That's right.
There's my truth, there's my reality, there's my divorce, there's my marriage. And so it's all about yourself. Everybody's all about themselves these days.
Well, yeah.
But you know, I have opportunity on occasion to be able to talk to folks at work about, you know, kind of interject a little religion there, and I've got a friend that you know, he's engaged, and he was telling me, you know, we thought we were gonna get married here, but now I have to go to some classes, and I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, we gotta go to a Catholic seminar. I'm like, really? I go, how long's this class? He said, well, it's 7 in the morning till 7 at night. I said, what are they gonna teach you? He goes, well, it's kind of a requirement in order to get married. I go, so who's married? Who's marrying who here? I said, it's just you and your wife, right? Yeah. I said, how is there a third person or a third entity involved? I said, all you have to do, let me make it easy for you. Make her happy. If she's happy, you'll be happy. That's all you need to worry about.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Make God happy first, and
Absolutely.
then
Absolutely.
the wife
Yeah.
second,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah, and think about, you know, the
There you
triangle
go.
that we can
There you
use
go.
sometimes. So we have this triangle, right?
Yep.
Have a man, we have a woman, and we have God on top. Or you can put marriage on top,
Yep.
you know, whichever. But if the marriage is more important than the woman, if God is more important than the woman, if God is more important than the man, you're fine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, my parallel, I was trying to show them that the Catholic Church is not the representation of God on earth.
Right.
Right, so
Yeah.
that's what they'll make themselves out to be, but they're not.
Yeah. Chris, you got something back there?
Yeah, so in Mark, this is not a treatise on divorce, remarriage, and all this stuff.
Sure.
It's very simply the Pharisees coming and asking about the law, a law that Jesus was under, a law that the apostles were under, a law that we're not under. And he aptly asks them about that so that he can make a point. That even before the Mosaic law, right, there's a principle. And that principle is that a man and a woman are to be together for life when they come together. That's the principle. It's the principle in the context of the law, although it's a universal truth. But it's not a law structure. And it's super important to understand that, because then when the disciples ask afterwards, and he makes the point, he's talking still about the law. He's not making some universal statement on here's how it's going to go, and then we get to do exactly what the Pharisees do and say, okay, so adultery is something that happens again and again, so as long as somebody is doing that, they're in an adulterous relationship, therefore it goes forever. It's not what God's saying here. What God's saying is, don't get divorced. Right? But he's not making a construct on what that should be. And that's where I think a lot of the challenges, and your diagram about God and the two people is both absolutely true and also makes me nervous, because you use diagrams and you say, well, you may be divorced from the woman, but not from God. But that's not what the diagram says. That's not what the structure, but that's the argument. And what we do is, rather than look at scriptures, we look at diagrams. And we look at principles. And we look at illustrations.
Yeah.
Rather than just looking at what God says in the context in which he said it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, okay, that's good, because we're going to address, because when you're talking about that, what it brings to mind is this area of this about the nature of the marriage bond being unchangeable by culture. Okay, so we're gonna deal with that, and that's gonna be directly dealing with that idea. Well, you know, you're not married to each other, but you're married to God. We'll talk about that. Okay, that's false, but we'll talk about that. But good points, really very good points. So when we look at this teaching from Mark's point of view, the book is directed to Romans. Okay, we talked in the beginning of the class about what all the reasons are why that's evident. So the question for Mark, in Mark's place, how are Roman Christians going to handle this? Okay, so he's writing about 64 AD, the time of Nero's persecution, and when the city burned and Nero blamed it on Christians, and it ignited this great persecution that lasted for the next 200 years. Okay? Now, within the Roman Empire, Roman Empire, there was a rampant dumping of unwanted wives. Okay? This is a historical fact. They were dumping wives left and right in the Roman Empire. And Roman women were also dumping unwanted men for other men. Okay? Let's use an example that we've seen from Mark chapter 6, verse 17. And this is John the Baptist and Herod and Herodias, right? And he says here in verse 17, 6:17, for Herod himself had sent and had John arrested and bound in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, because he had married her. Okay? For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So she divorced Philip for Herod. And that was not lawful. Okay? And so here in this case, among Jews, we're just pointing out that amongst Jews, women weren't allowed to initiate a divorce. In this case, my understanding is that she divorced Philip for Herod. Okay? So it's in this broad context of Romans dumping each other left and right that the Jews are asking Jesus if they can divorce their wives. Okay? That question just didn't come out of the blue. It's in the, it's in the environment, it's in the atmosphere, it's being done all the time. So is it lawful for a man to divorce a wife? Now, I'm sure if you've been around a while that you've heard of Hillel and Shammai, which were these two leading rabbis of the day who argued about this lawfulness, and particularly from Deuteronomy 24, this indecency, and we're going to talk about that later. What is that? What is exactly is being talked about there? So we want to examine that a bit. But Shammai had the more conservative view. It had to be for immorality. Okay? Hillel, on the other hand, had a much more liberal view. You can divorce her for whatever, if you're, whatever it is. Okay? You've done, I don't want her anymore, she's old, blah, 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 whatever it is, right? I'm tired of her. That's what I meant by old, I'm just tired of her. And so the Jews come to Jesus in this context, and they want to know who he stands with. Okay? Which one of these rabbis does Jesus stand with? And we're going to find that Jesus stands with the Father. He's not going to quote any rabbis. He's going to quote God. Okay. So Mark mentions a woman, as we see it in chapter 6, divorcing a husband. But Matthew does not mention that because he was talking, his audience was Jews. So he doesn't deal with a woman divorcing a man, because amongst Jews that wasn't done. Okay. And so we come to the question, yes?
The example in Mark 6, aren't those Jews? Herod and...
Not practicing the law of Jews.
Okay.
Yeah. But they were Jewish.
Right.
Yeah, they were Jewish. Okay.
But they weren't bound by the laws of Jews.
Well, they weren't living by the law.
They were living by it.
Yeah. So, obviously, right.
Yeah.
And so the question here, is it lawful for a man to divorce a wife? Next time, that's where we'll start. And then we're going to we're going to just kind of go through it and take that. And all the questions that come up, I think, are going to be answered adequately. Okay? At least that's what our goal will be. So with that, we'll end there, and I'll say the famous words, class dismissed.
I want to just keep going.
I know.